Good morning, everyone. This is Emily Mooney, a project coordinator at OCASI, welcoming you to this morning's webinar for the Maximizing Governance project on conflict resolution. With me today is Howard Tan. Harold, I'm so sorry. Harold Tan. Thank you. And we will be talking about conflict resolution. Harold is an experienced facilitator from St. Stephen's Community House. He'll talk more about his role and experience there. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. You can ask any questions. We're very, very happy for questions. We'd like this to be as interactive as possible. You can ask questions in the conversation, in the chat pane, in the questions pane of your webinar software, or I will be keeping an eye on my inbox as well. My email is emooney, M-O-O-N-E-Y, @ocasi.org. One other thing is that the handout, the PowerPoint presentation that you'll be seeing today is available as a download in the handout section of the webinar software. And one final thing is that there is a short survey at the end of the webinar. This is part of the evaluation component of our project. We would be very grateful if you would stick around for a minute or two after the webinar is concluded so that you can give us feedback about how we did today. Okay, Harold, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. I have to chuckle because apparently I look like a Howard. There are a lot of people when they're first introduced to me and they just call me Howard, and often I just keep recognizing that name because it's a lot easier. So hello everyone, my name is Harold Tan and I'm from St. Stephen's Community House in their Conflict Resolution and Training Department. St. Stephen's is a community-based agency, and the Conflict Resolution and Training Department offers a number of services. One of them is a free community mediation service that is available to all Toronto residents, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that at the end of the workshop. And the other part is a fee-based professional services function where we go in and do training such as this, workplace mediations, meeting facilitations, and we also offer a number of single-day and full-day courses related to conflict resolution. So the hat that I'm wearing today is a conflict resolution workshop trainer, and I wanted to spend a bit of time addressing scope. Because I know that there's a high degree of interest in this topic. Conflict resolution, or what I'm doing for you today, is a highly condensed version of a one-day workshop. And typically the kinds of workshops that St. Stephen's offers are multi-day. What that means is you are not necessarily going to have the answers to all of your questions in the next 2 hours, simply because conflict resolution is a complex, multifaceted, multidimensional subject, because human beings are complex, multidimensional, and multifaceted. So if it feels as if I am touching on a few points that you haven't received, the grand unified theory of the universe, that's a deliberate, there's a reason for it. What we'll be focusing on is a foundational skill that we call active listening, which I'm going to suggest is really critical for us just to move forward, before we can even think about the various options and venues and processes for resolving conflict. At the heart is the need for us to actively listen. So that's really going to be the focus of what I'll be doing in the next 2 hours. And Emily, can I just check, I have 2 hours of your time and the participants?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. The other piece that I want to talk to you about is the delivery. Typically, conflict resolution workshops are always in person, and there's a good reason for that. You do not learn how to resolve conflict by having a person talk at you or reading material. It might be useful in terms of theoretical, but conflict resolution is a very skills-based, applied type of learning. And so much of the learning occurs when the trainer is interacting with participants. And just as equally important, the participants are interacting with each other and sharing their experiences. We do a lot of small group work. We do a lot of role plays, which I know some people have conflicted feelings on. And there's a reason for that. It's because we want you to get outside of your comfort zone, to challenge your own discomfort, and to really try and stretch yourself. And you really can't do that, as I said, by me talking at a machine or talking at you. So those are sort of my two cover my derriere disclaimers in terms of what we'll be discussing today. So the format that we'll be using is essentially the format that I used when we did this workshop live last night. So it will feel as if the approaches are very much based on we are all in the same room and we're talking as human beings live. And what I will do is we'll do our best to incorporate your chats, your emails, and all that. So please, please, please say what you need to say. There are no wrong answers. This is an opportunity for you to participate as fully and as richly as you want to, because conflict resolution is actually a fascinating topic. So without further ado, Emily, can we go to the next slide, please?
Certainly.
Okay, so what we'll be covering in this webinar are some very broad topics. We'll talk a little bit about conflict because you can't really start thinking about how to resolve conflict until you have a bit of an understanding as to what conflict is. We'll be doing an exercise on good versus bad listening, and I'll talk to you about how it's set up in real life and how we're going to try to modify that for the webinar. We'll be spending some time talking about active listening techniques. What is it? How do we think about, in a very conscious and intentional manner, what active listening constitutes? We'll be putting some of those techniques into practice, and I think what we'll probably spend more time doing is giving you statements and asking you to respond to them, or giving you scenarios and asking you to respond to them. And the final piece will be the community mediation portion as to what is it, what kinds of services do St. Stephen's offer in respect to community mediation, and perhaps some clarification as to how community mediation may be different from the other models of mediation that you have experienced or seen. So again, feel free to ask any and all questions. I think we have the time to have an expansive discussion, and I would dearly love to hear from all of you. So without further ado, what I'm going to ask all of you to think about is, when I say the word conflict, what are the words that immediately come to your mind? And feel free to put them in your chat. This is really more of a brainstorming. First words that come to your mind: conflict. Don't
be shy.
Don't be shy.
We're happy to hear from you. I can speak from personal experience. And at last night's workshop, we had quite a lot of positive ideas about conflict. People were mentioning that it can be an opportunity. I've been in other conflict resolution training where people have mentioned fear and confrontation and even a little bit of panic. I see one answer here: difference of opinions, which is quite an interesting one. Maybe you'd like to speak about that a bit, Harold.
That's a very enlightened view of conflict. Absolutely. You know, we live in this incredibly diverse, chaotic city where people have very, very different beliefs, values, opinions about things. And part of what's interesting is how we address those differences of opinions. And the how part is going to be a common thread in what we're talking about. You know, given that we are in this diverse community in the city, how do we, you know, respect each other's opinions without causing conflict? And I'll be talking a little bit more about that. But certainly, yeah, you know, I share that your experience, Emily, that for many people, when they think about conflict, it's usually a very unpleasant, negative, gut-wrenching experience. I mean, I would suggest that for most of us, we go through extreme lengths to avoid conflict. We move to the other side of the country. We develop stomach ulcers, or we self-medicate with alcohol and drugs. It's the dirty word that no one wants to talk about. And it's usually because we're not great at receiving it, and we're usually really, really good at creating it. And so it often sheds light on the less attractive parts of human nature and ourselves. And it's everywhere. So there are usually very, very strong negative connotations associated with conflict. And part of what we are doing today is to encourage you to shift a little bit. Certainly last night, there were many, many enlightened people who clearly had gone through conflict resolution workshop training before because they emphasized the positive, and that's very, very true. I think I'm fairly confident in saying that for many, many people, however, they associate things like confrontation, unpleasantness, bad. It's that visceral, guttural feeling of, oh, I really, really hate this, and it's so hard to let that go when we transfer to other spheres of our lives. So if we have a negative experience in the workplace, we tend to bring it home with us and take it upon the poor people who are, in our personal lives. Or we tend to sit with it and dwell with it, and it's hard to get it out of our system. So are there any other thoughts, comments, words, brainstorming, in addition to the very courageous person who wrote difference of opinions? Please, I really enjoy the interaction. It's a bit of a strange experience for me talking to a machine. So.
One has just come in through email. For this person, when conflict comes up, disagreement, but often there is a power dynamic involved, and one does not feel one can voice one's own opinion.
Absolutely. Power dynamics are always something that mediators, for example, are constantly aware of. And we'll talk a bit more about the mediation model near the end. That's not the primary focus of this particular workshop. And certainly, power imbalances and how we navigate that, particularly in cultural contexts, are something that we always think about. Generally speaking, in many cultures where there is a strong hierarchical basis, the person with the lesser power is not encouraged to, or is not given permission to express their needs, feelings, wants in an honest way. The expectation is that the person with the lesser power or status is expected to cede the floor to the person with the higher power or status. Clash of values and visions is another one, and absolutely that's true. How do we navigate, all of these differences of opinions, of values, of vision, and get along in this extremely complicated city, or even an extremely complicated workplace? So active listening will, I hope, address some of that, those very valid questions. Let's go to the next slide, please.
Run. Things to keep in mind about conflict.
Correct.
Here we go.
So things to keep in mind about conflict, and this is St. Stephen's take on the nature of conflict. One of the things we believe is that it's inevitable. Change comes through conflict. You can't get around it. You can't hide from it. So why don't we find a different way of dealing with it? And some of you have already talked about how conflict can be an opportunity for learning and dialogue. That a conflict managed well can actually lead to a very, very successful, productive, innovative negotiation. And if it's not, and a small matter that is not handled well can result in something that's far more unpleasant. And unfortunately, we tend to have more experiences with the latter than we do with the former. So part of what we want to suggest is that it is an opportunity for learning and dialogue. It's about learning more about the other side. It's about how that person sees the world, what's important to them. And I think it speaks again to that whole values, vision, and opinions. The other part is that conflict is very much about substance and relationship. Often when we think about conflict, it's usually about a thing. It's about, a dispute over, let's say in a workplace, workload allocation or scheduling or vacation coverage or all of that kind of stuff. That's the stuff, that's the substance. Where we tend to downplay or not think as much is the relationship. I mean, it's likely that you're here because you want to know how to resolve conflict in a more effective way with people that you have an ongoing relationship with, whether it be a family member, a significant other, your boss, your coworker. So there's an ongoing relationship that must be recognized beyond the immediate substantive or concrete thing that may be in dispute at this particular moment. So it's thinking that the how part, the relationship nurturing, the rapport building, is just as critical as the substantive part. And that handling conflict well can be a very empowering experience. We know how we feel when we don't handle conflict well. All of us have done incredibly stupid things when we are in the middle of some, and I continue to do often some incredibly stupid things, so I do not come here as some higher enlightened human being. It's a constant struggle, and having some basic tools, being able to think more intentionally and less emotionally can be a very empowering experience. Certainly for me, as I go through my own personal journey, what I have learned to do is to be more open and curious and to try and be less judgmental, because I was raised to be very, very judgmental. And so learning how to sort of diminish that judgmental approach and to be open and curious and go, tell me more, is part of how I try to live my life with a great deal of more curiosity as to how people see the world.
If I might add, that openness and curiosity can be very, very valuable when you're doing human service work. You've probably heard about the importance of it if you are on the front lines of a community service organization. Without the openness and curiosity, you can't understand the issue that the service seeker is coming to you with. And if you don't have a good, clear understanding of what the issue is, you can't provide appropriate information and referrals and support.
So one of my favorite metaphors in describing this is, if a person comes to me and says, I believe the moon is made out of blue cheese, part of what I say is, oh, okay, tell me more. What kind of cheese is it? Is it made out of cow's milk or goat's milk? Is it a gorgonzola or a Stilton? If another person comes to me and says, I believe that the moon is made out of tofu, I want to learn more. So it's that open and honest curiosity that is something that I try to cultivate. So there's a new comment that says, I find that some staff are uncomfortable in communicating exactly what they mean or want, and sometimes conflict gives them confidence to finally say what is bothering them. So, okay, so uncomfortable in communicating exactly. So that's true, right? We're not taught in school how to assertively and respectfully articulate our needs, wants, and feelings. Often there are cultural strictures against being able to express those things honestly. So part of the wider training around conflict resolution is, how do you combine this almost seemingly incompatible mix of being assertive and respectful when saying, this is what's important to me, this is how I'm feeling, in a way that doesn't provoke a defensive reaction on the part of the listener. Perhaps this is a good opportunity for us then to go into active listening. I just want to think and see, because I don't think we need to talk about sort of how conflict is experienced in the various spheres of our lives. I think all of us know that we do it both in the professional and personal spheres.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move on.
Let's move on to
next slide.
So I think we talked already about what comes to our mind when we talk about conflict. So let's go to the next one, please. So how do we get to that point where we can be assertive and respectful? Part of what we're going to be spending a fair amount of time this morning talking about is active listening. And active listening is something which we're not really taught how to do. It's a very different kind of listening than the other types of listening which I think we're more comfortable doing. One form of listening that I'm very good at, and unfortunately most of us are very good at as well, is what we call listening to defend. And the classic example of listening to defend is the yes, but statement, right? Where I can say yes, da 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 da, but da 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 da, and the only thing the listener hears are the words after the word but. And usually listening to defend is, let me tell you why I'm right. Listening to criticize or attack is usually listening to tell the other person why they're wrong. And most of the time we engage in those two modes of listening, where we're not really hearing what the other person is trying to tell us. It's all about how we prepare for the refutation, the rebuttal. And that's the classic sort of legal drama approach that we have that says, well, of course you're wrong and I'm right. Active listening is a very, very different departure. Active listening is listening to understand. And I want you to sit for a moment, a little bit of thinking about that. Listening to understand isn't listening to problem solve, where I tell you how to solve your problem or what's wrong with you or all of that, or why I think I know the solution to whatever's bothering you. Listening to understand is being very, very open and curious about how that person sees the situation, how they're feeling about it, all of those elements. And that's where the moon out of blue cheese and moon out of tofu example is very apt, because yes, it's ridiculous, and it's also listening for what's important. And it's acknowledging what you are hearing in terms of the facts that I view, the feelings that I have associated with that situation, and the values and the needs. So values are things which are important to me, which which matter, and needs are again things which I want. All too often we listen to what a person is presenting on the surface without unpacking some of the things. And the classic example I give is that if you're in IKEA and you see this couple who are clearly in a relationship arguing loudly and viciously over the size of the coffee table you want to bring, chances are that the conflict is not about the coffee table. It's about something else. They're just using the coffee table as a surface issue because they don't necessarily want to, or not, haven't really talked about the underlying things. So the active listening helps us unpack, what's underneath the iceberg. And for those of you who have taken conflict resolution training, you've probably sort of seen that image or the metaphor. So active listening means listening to understand, not to insert your opinion or your judgment. And so the way that you do so is by asking a lot of open questions. And I think for most of you, you've had some kind of training that talks about the difference between open and closed questions. Closed questions are designed to elicit a yes or no answer. It's the classic cross-examination in a trial where someone says, "Oh, Millie, is it not true that you were, found to be in the North York Public Library last night in a conflict resolution workshop when you said that you would be, at the symphony?" Ha! I scored a point. Open questions are, tell me more. I really want to know more about your facts, about your feelings, about your values and your needs, the positive intentions that you have when you're telling your story. For most of us who are in conflict, the one universal theme that we get is, I need to tell you, listener, that I'm a good person. I'm the victim in all of this. I've done my best to be reasonable, respectful, a noble human being, and it's the other person who is the awful one, who is disrespectful, who is all done all these terrible things. But I need to convince you, listener, that I'm a good person. And so under trying to flesh out, trying to understand what are some of those positive values that everyone has, even though they may be in conflict, is important, because everyone, I would suggest, is trying to communicate that they are good. That's the life narrative that all of us want to try and at least communicate to the outside world. So active listening here is taking some time to invite information and to acknowledge. And so when we talk about active listening techniques, let's see, we don't have the slide here. So when we talk about active listening techniques, we're really talking about sort of two elements. One of them is acknowledging information, and the other one is inviting information. So when you're acknowledging information, what you're doing are things like restating and summarizing. So it sounds as if, is that right? Did I hear you correctly? So what you want to ensure is that the person who is talking to you, the speaker, is feeling heard. You've captured the main elements. So the restating and summarizing is one of the foundational active listening techniques. And you want to provide enough information so that the person really feels as if you are hearing some of the details which are important to them. Another part of acknowledging information is to reflect the feelings. So naming the emotion. It sounds as if you're feeling frustrated. What I hear is that you're angry when your coworker did this to you. What's important here is that acknowledging doesn't necessarily mean that you agree. And this is a tricky thing to navigate because it is very much about the nuances associated with language. In active listening, you may acknowledge how that person is feeling without agreeing with what they are saying. And it's perhaps a difference framed another way between empathizing and sympathizing. So sympathizing says, I share the same feeling that you have. So when you're offering condolences to someone who's experiencing loss, what you're saying is, I share the sadness with you because all of us have, can tap into an experience where we experience loss. Empathizing is recognizing the emotion. You don't necessarily say, I share that emotion, it is recognizing it. So empathy is what I'm hearing you telling me is that you are very, very sad because, someone special in your life recently passed away. It's nuanced, it's subtle, and it's so important because if you cross the line into agreeing, you run the risk of that person perceiving you as being on their side. And so if you're trying to be somewhat of an honest broker, you go down to that slippery slope. The other part, so that's a bit of a tangential side. When going back to the reflecting the feelings, it's also very important and very useful sometimes to name the emotion because for some people, and I'm going to grossly generalize here, many men are not socially conditioned to have an emotional vocabulary. And so sometimes when you actually say it sounds as if you're feeling sad, a very common response is, you're right. It's almost like, I didn't even realize that, what I'm talking to you about is sadness or anger or frustration. So it's often getting the speaker to go, oh, wow, the light bulb just came in my brain. This is the emotion because I can now put a word to it. Another element of the acknowledging information in active listening is reflecting the values and the positive intentions. And I talked a little bit about that already, in that we all have values that we are raising. Often in workplace conflicts, there's things like respect, maybe punctuality, responsibility. And when I perceive someone as perhaps violating the values that I hold dear, that's often when the conflict comes. Because if I perceive, say, punctuality as a value, and Emily as my coworker is always late, I start to translate that as she doesn't share the same values, she doesn't respect me, and I will start to act upon it. Because I believe that showing respect to everyone in my office is punctuality. Clearly, Emily is being disrespectful because she is habitually late, and that's all I need to know before I start getting into the grr of the conflict. Positive intentions, again, is, as I said before, for most of us, we want to be seen by the world as good people. And that regardless of how insane or crazy making or whatever my behavior may be, I generally have some kind of a positive intention behind it. There was a very, very good point made by one of the participants yesterday in terms of what happens if that positive intention really, really clashes with a fundamental value. Let's say that person is pretty racist, and they want in the course of their behavior, they're doing things that are really challenging your personal values. That's hard. And one of the challenges of active listening is taking your own personal views and putting them in a corner for the time being and trying to understand why that person is doing it. If is it because that person is, sees sort of a larger positive value in terms of the views they're holding, and is coming to an understanding. So that's where, again, where the acknowledgement doesn't necessarily mean agreeing. It's hard because in active listening, this is another great point that a participant made, you have to really think of your self-care as well. We have all of our own biases, and we have to own up to it. And if we are being triggered, and if we know that at that particular moment we are not able to have an active listening conversation, then we take steps to reschedule, to do it at another time, and to practice that self-care, whether it means a good night's sleep, whether it means yoga, whether it means having a good meal, whatever, but to really make sure that we're in the headspace to be able to have that conversation. But I digress. So active listening, we talked a little bit about acknowledging information, and under acknowledging information, we talked about restating key points. We talked about reflecting feelings, and we talked about reflecting values and positive intentions. The other element about active listening is inviting information. So it's encouraging the speaker in a safe space to talk about what's important to them. And this is where setting comes as an important element. So we talked a little bit about sort of the mindset, of for you, the person who is going to be engaging in this active listening sort of interaction, you have to be in the right space to do so. So that's the self-care. That's this is not something that you do on the spur of the moment when you're on the way to the bathroom or when you run into this person after work in the parking lot. You really have to be in a certain space where you're going to be intentionally giving that person your full and undivided attention. The setting is that quiet space free of distraction where you know that no one's going to interrupt you, where the phone is on mute. It's all of these things which indicate that you are dedicating a specific amount of time to really listen and hear without any of the distractions. So one of the surest ways, and all of us know this, to anger or alienate someone is to engage in sort of nonverbal behavior where it's clearly you're distracted, you're ignoring them, you are not paying attention, and that the nonverbal and the paraverbal just flames things so much. So encouraging the speaker is partly sort of giving them that full and undivided attention in a quiet, distraction-free space where both of you can have an honest conversation without all of the ding ding dings that happen in our world. And the second part of inviting information is asking clarifying questions. So tell me more. You mentioned that you felt really frustrated when Emily showed up late at a meeting for the third time of the week. What happened? How long has this been happening? Was there a time when you had a different kind of relationship with Emily? So personal history. What's really, really important to them, more details about incidences. If unpacking a feeling, that's often a lot of clarifying questions. So you are almost like a reporter where you're saying, I want to know more about your story. I'm not here at this point to assess whether what you're telling me is objectively true. What I want to know is just sort of more, I want to have a three-dimensional understanding and nuance about what's going on. Any questions, comments so far? The webinar folks have been somewhat quiet, so feel free to ask anything. It may be a bit tangential, but we have the luxury of time. So seize the moment.
You can use the question pane, or again, you can email me. It's emooney, MOONEY, @ocasi.org. One point that came up for me when you were talking about helping people name what they're feeling was something that I learned in my social work program, which was the phrase, name it to tame it. I found that very, very useful.
Name it to tame it.
Yes.
So how does that work?
So if you see that the person is feeling very sad, then you could name the sadness. And once the person has a name for whatever it is that they're feeling, then they can start to address it and they can start to manage it better. If they don't know what it is that they're feeling, then it's much more difficult to manage.
Yeah, And certainly I can personally relate to that because I grew up in sort of a more traditional Chinese culture. And I would suggest that for many cultures, including the Chinese, articulating your emotions is not something we're comfortable doing. It's really, really hard. So part of my journey is developing a more robust emotional vocabulary. And I would also say it's a gross generalization that men have a greater difficulty being able to do so because they're just not socially conditioned to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So often it can be an enormous relief. And active listening can be exhausting. So I want to put it out there. That's part of the reason why the self-care is so important, is because one of the great stats I learned from in neuroscience is the brain occupies 2% of the body's mass but consumes 20% of the body's energy. And so when you are really, really paying full and undivided attention to a person, you're asking open questions, you're really trying to get more and more information, it can be extremely exhausting because you are teasing out things that the person may not be telling you point blank, like an emotion, right? So you're processing, you're analyzing, you're doing all of this critical thinking, and then you're checking in with that person and saying, is this correct? Am I hearing you? So if you are tired at the end of doing active listening, there's a very good reason for that. And for me, after these kinds of things, particularly mediation, I am done. I do not want to deal with humanity. I go home and I sit on my couch and I have a good meal and I drool in front of Netflix. That's the way that I recharge my batteries, being the high introvert that I am.
I saw something very, very interesting last week about professional chess players and how one very, very high-level chess player had to bow out of a tournament because he had lost 20 pounds over the course of multiple days of the tournament. He was burning such high caloric, his caloric requirements were so high, he was burning at least 6,000 calories a day just sitting there thinking.
I believe it. The last mediation I did at the workplace was 9 hours. Now the parties were there for the full 9 hours, but we, the mediators, were on it for 9 hours. And believe me, by the end of that, I was done. I could have eaten, a 5-course meal. Is there an email that we need to look at?
No, we're okay.
We're good? Okay. So I think what we're going to do is now try at least. Oh, we have a new question.
Oh, there's a couple of questions here.
Okay. Do you want to scroll up?
Yeah.
Give me something.
Just a second.
I recently had an incident where a co-op got overwhelmed in the office and ran out crying. She then messaged 2 of my 4 staff to come out and give her emotional support. Because our office is so small, it really created a split within the staff component. I found myself caretaking all the staff. This was exhausting. There are some contract people who create drama in the workplace as part of ways to bring attention to themselves. Okay. So this is a very, very specific context, and part of what this training doesn't cover is a very important topic around boundaries. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason why I very intentionally outline the scope of this is because boundaries, how do you deal with difficult people who demonstrate or exhibit destructive behavior, and you have to deal with it. That's a very different type of topic because you want to demonstrate empathy, and yet you have a workplace that needs to be run. You have to put in some boundaries over what is appropriate. What I'm going to suggest is, let me think about this.
It's a tough question.
Part of the challenge in doing this is there are so many different reasons why a person may be engaging in difficult or destructive behavior. Depending on what those reasons are, the motivations, you have different responses. Active listening is a very good foundational skill for you to understand, what those motivations may be. It is outside of the scope of this particular workshop to sort of take the next step forward and go, okay, now that you've understood fully what the situation is, this is how you may want to respond. And this is particularly true when you have a small workplace and there's a disruptive behavior and is impacting multiple people. It may require multiple responses all at the same time. It may be a response towards the person who is exhibiting the behavior. It may be some further coaching and training as to how we respond when this last minuteness of it comes. I mean, you talked about this person, engaging in attention seeking. I would probably want to have an active listening conversation with you, Tanya Williams, to understand a little bit more about, how you see things. Is this a pattern? Is this more, is it the first time? What's your workplace culture like? These are all the kinds of questions I would want to ask before I would feel comfortable proposing any kind of options. So I thank you for creating that. It's a hard question because I can't tell you how to respond based on limited amount of information. And I think that's the whole point behind the active listening, in that we don't know what we don't know. And gathering information is the first step before we can figure out how to approach it and what to do. So I'm sorry that doesn't comprehensively answer your question. I think it's the best that I can think of at the time. Emily, did you want to add anything?
I think you've pretty much covered it. I think if you find out the reason for the attention seeking, finding the reason can be, you can do it through active listening in some cases. And if you understand the reason, then maybe you could provide the person with suggestions about ways to manage it.
Yeah, I mean, active listening does not excuse, or so, does not mean that you can't, sorry, let me take a step back. Setting boundaries and active listening can happen, and they coexist. It's not an either or. So active listening, you can set boundaries and active listen. It's the how you shape that. Because it does sound as if, part of your situation that you described, Tanya, is the boundary setting. And until I get to know better, I mean, for that person who may be engaging in behavior, is this a disability-related issue? Because if it's a disability-related issue that triggers accommodations, it's a very, very different response. It still may be setting boundaries, but again, it's a different approach given, what the Ontario Human Rights Code says. So again, nuances and all of that. So the next one, Mr. Wirtz, in the interest of building a relationship, in order to build trust, is it listening without sharing one's own perspective a challenge? Yes, is a short answer to your question. If I am parking my own personal values, judgments, way that I see the world, and I grew up being pretty judgmental, I'll admit that, it's hard. That's why I try as much as possible to cultivate that sense of curiosity. So that if a person does in their heart of hearts believe that the moon is made out of blue cheese, I want to know, okay, is it made out of cow's milk? Where did you come to that conclusion? Is it a gorgonzola or an English Stilton? These are the things that I want to know. I may have my own very, very strong views as to this rather unconventional belief in the composition of our lunar body, but the listening with openness and curiosity is the way that I remind myself I'm just here to understand, and I'm acknowledging and not agreeing. How can we encourage others to be an active listener? Well, one very, very straightforward way is to model the behavior. In mediation, that's what we do. In mediation, we don't teach people how to actively listen. What we do is we model the behavior. And what we hope is that people start to consciously or subconsciously mirror the behavior that we are modeling. So if you practice on your own how to be a more effective active listener, chances are some of that will start to wear off on the people with whom you spend the most amount of time with, because they will start to see the benefits of doing that. I was at a workshop recently where there was a staff member and some tenant representatives, and the staff member subsequently said, wow, I'm going to try this with my significant other at home because, yes, I've been through all this kind of training before, but yeah, maybe spending a bit more time listening to my partner at home is something that I can work on as a personal growth. So active listening can be infectious. the fact that you are here, taking the time out of your busy lives on a Tuesday afternoon to listen to me drone on, already tells me that you have an interest in it, and it's the how part. So maybe that's a good segue into some of the exercises that I would typically do live in person. So what I did last night was I put on a piece of flip chart paper a number of what I would call angry statements. So this is an angry statement, and you are on the receiving end of that angry statement. So the first angry statement that I put out was this: I'm tired of this stuff. No one ever respects me around here. I get all of this extra work dumped on me when other people are sitting around doing nothing. I'm going to repeat that. I'm tired of this stuff. No one ever respects me around here. I get all of this extra work dumped on me when other people are sitting around doing nothing. So how would you employ some of the active listening techniques? The acknowledging information, the inviting information, restating facts, recognizing feelings, recognizing values and positive intentions, clarifying questions, all of that. How would you use those active listening techniques to a person who has just made this statement? I'm tired of this stuff. No one ever respects me around here. I get all of this extra work dumped on me when other people are sitting around doing nothing.
We'll give you a minute or two to think about possible responses. We've had a request for me to repeat my email, which is eMooney, let me start again, EMOONEY @ocasi.org. Okay. Seen a response to the scenario that Harold mentioned. Question or the statement, tell me more.
Tell me more is always a fantastic open question. So what I'm going to encourage you to do is, can you identify a particular substantive issue or a feeling or a value behind what that angry statement said? I'm tired of this stuff. No one ever respects me around here. I get all of this extra work dumped on me when other people are sitting around doing nothing. And yes, this is hard.
It is hard.
Because we are not trained or conditioned to think this way.
Okay. So I can read out the comment that we've just received. I would first sit with them privately so that it didn't impact the whole office. I would let them know what I believe them. In our office, so many people are working so many different tasks. I would go through all their tasks with them, and I would see if there were things that could be taken off their list. Sometimes someone has different energy at different times.
So that is all excellent, because what you talked a little bit over here is the setting, right? You want to do it in a quiet, distraction-free space. You don't want to do it in the middle of a crowded cubicle. One of the temptations that many of us have is to go into problem solving before we spend some time active listening. And by no means am I suggesting that in every situation do you want to spend a lot of time active listening. It's a scalable thing. What I would suggest, Tanya, is before you get into the how can we sort of resolve that, you may want to spend a little bit of time just asking more open questions, like tell me more, right? It's what are some of the examples that you could provide about what you mean when you feel disrespected? Can you tell me a little bit more about the kind of work that you're being asked to do? You want to ask all those sort of open questions. Can you go up the scroll, please? Sure. I just want to make sure that I read through all of what Tanya said. So the problem solving part is completely sound, and I agree with you. What I would suggest is before we go into the problem solving, we want to spend a little bit of time just asking a lot of open, non-judgmental questions. And it's completely understandable that so many of us are geared towards problem solving because that's how our entire work culture is structured, right? It's all about results. do things, you come in and you have 15,000 fires that you have to brush out or stamp out by the end of the day. It's all go, 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 go. Where active listening really has great value is when you know that something is persistent, it's not going away, it's still there, it's affecting a lot of people, there's a relationship at stake, often with a co-worker relationship or a manager-staff relationship, and there are a lot of emotions at stake. If you have all of those elements, that's usually, an indication to you that perhaps you want to spend a little bit more time into problem solving, into the active listening before you go into the problem solving, because active listening may uncover some options that you didn't know are possible, or because we all have sort of our standard toolkit, where if we've encountered the same situation 20 times over, we go straight to that toolkit and grab that particular tool. Active listening says, are there some creative options that we don't know because we don't have enough information? And that might help address something that has been chronic or persistent because we've tried certain things that just doesn't appear to be working. But thank you for that very comprehensive response, Tanya. And you're right, different energy, different times. So that's where the timing comes in, right? You want to make sure that both you and the person that you're going to be engaging in the active listening experience or interaction are in the right space to do so. So for example, you do not want to engage with me just before lunch because my blood sugar will be tanking and the only thing I'll be thinking about is food. I'm a much a nicer and reasonable human being after I've eaten. So Fariba, I'm one of a charitable organization board of directors. The other board, I've never listened to that.
Yeah, I'm going to read it slowly.
Also,
I'm one of the charitable organization board of director members. One of the other board of director members never listens to another one and says what she wants. What has to be our reflection?
It has to be our reflection. So we actually have a scenario that may cover that. So what I'm going to do is just ask to park that. Maybe we'll cover that in one of our scenarios. That will be later on in this webinar. Because what I'm hearing from you, Fariba, is that this is one of those interpersonal conflicts where, for whatever reason, those two people are not listening. They are not prepared to hear what the other one has to say. Okay, so next one, so a staff can do 10 tasks. Okay, that's the problem.
Okay, so another suggestion is to acknowledge that the person feels tired with too much work to do. Acknowledge the anger at having to do too much work and asking what are the specific tasks that prompted these statements.
Yeah, so acknowledgement versus agreement, so very important. You may agree if you are generally in agreement. As I said, the danger of that is you risk the perception that you are in support of that other person, or you're in support of that person. And if you are in a situation where two of your colleagues are having very, very different views, there's a risk that you get drawn into it, you get sucked into it, because the other person may have a very diametrically different opinion or viewpoint of what the nature of the conflict is.
Mm-hmm. So the question that's just come in through email, a possible response to an angry statement, why do you think so? What kinds of work have been dumped on you? You spoke last night about the potential danger of why questions.
So why can be a bit of a dicey question to ask, because why often ask the person to provide their version of the conflict narrative. And I talked about how in the conflict narrative, usually it's the I'm the good one, I'm the reasonable one, I'm the one that's trying my best, is the other person who is the devil incarnate. And so the risk with why is we risk having that person retell you that particular conflict narrative and becomes more entrenched. What we want to do in active listening is to get them away from that entrenched, this is, I'm the victim and I'm going to retell this story because they probably have retold this story to everyone willing to listen about why they are the one who has been done wrong. So one way of very subtly getting them to move away from that is to rephrase it. So, rather than saying, you're so right so many times,
This is the why. This is
Right, the
what's your
why.
email. Why do you
Ask,
think so?
it's about, tell me more. Can you give me an example? How are you feeling when this happens?
Mhm.
What goes, what's the impact on you when Emily is habitually late? Well, it screws up the agenda. I find, I don't get a chance to get everything that I need to get in the meeting done. Often I have to re-explain things. It's really, really frustrating, and I know everyone's time is valuable, and we're all meeting, have endless meetings. So right? So I'm covering all of the values, the frustrations as to the impact that Emily's tardiness is having. That's the kind of information that you want to know. Because that's important. Those are the values, those are the emotions that I have in terms of, hey, I have a positive value when I'm, despite the fact that I'm being really mean to Emily, because what that positive value is, I want to make sure that people are, the meeting is effective. That's a positive value. I want to make sure that people's time are respected because there are, 5 other people in that meeting room. Those are all positive values. How I'm manifesting that values by, yelling at Emily and telling her that she's an awful person may not be the most effective way of resolving that or dealing with that, but there is a positive value behind why I do what I do.
Mhm. So next question, is it worth asking about moments in the person's experience where they have felt valued, that their work was satisfying?
Absolutely. One very effective tool of active listening is, was there a time when things were better? Was there a time when you got along with the other person? Was there a time when you felt less stressed? That gives you very valuable information in terms of the history. Is this a recent conflict? Has this been dragging on for years? Did it just happen to coincide when half the department was laid off? Did it just happen to coincide when there was a new manager that came in 6 months ago? Did it just happen to coincide when the dog that I've loved for 15 years died?
Mhm.
What's going on, right? So learning, about when there was a happier time is important, and that gives you, something about the history. And often with many of these kinds of conflicts, there is the history. There's a lot of water under the bridge, and you want to ask, was there a time when the two of you got along in a better way, or was it, oil and water from the get-go, where, the first day Emily was here, I took offense at the red sweater she was wearing and just went downhill from there.
So also one suggestion about the person who's always late. There could be any number of reasons for that. And if the person who's very angry about the lateness digs into the reasons, maybe there's some sort of religious accommodation that's needed. Maybe the meetings are scheduled at a poor time. Maybe if they're first thing in the morning and the person who's always late is commuting 2 hours each way in the subway and had a delay that day.
Maybe Emily's childcare arrangements changed, and she is now responsible for ensuring that her child is at daycare within a certain amount of time, and that's impacting her ability to show up, right? You don't know what you don't know, and that's the whole purpose behind active listening. Is saying, okay, before I jump into the conclusion that Emily is an irresponsible worker who doesn't respect the time of her coworkers, maybe I want to delve a little bit deeper to ask in a very non-judgmental manner, can you tell me a little bit about what's going on? Particularly if, say, this, Emily has always been punctual. It's only been happening in the past 3 months that she's habitually late. Maybe I want to find out, what happened 3 months ago? I don't know.
Okay, so that's it for the questions that we have now. Should we move on to the next scenario?
So how much time do we have? Okay,
We're at 12 o'clock.
Okay, and we have another hour, so we
One
have
more
plenty of time. So let me try another angry statement. So this is Angry Harold making this angry statement, and you are the listener, or on the receiving end of this angry statement. You act like you're better than everyone else, like no one else can ever have a good idea. I don't like people talking to me like I'm a child. You act like you're better than everyone else, like no one else can ever have a good idea. I don't like people talking to me like I'm a child.
pretty loaded thing to say.
And I'd probably be doing so in a much more angry tone. You act like you're better than everyone else, like no one else can ever have a good idea. I don't like people talking to me like I'm a child.
So we could ask things, there are possible responses to a statement like this, but the first reaction that I would have almost certainly is defensiveness.
Right. And part of the strategy, the intentionality behind active listening is for you to ask yourself, am I capable of having an active listening conversation with Angry Harold right now? Or do I need to prepare myself? Right. So what you want to think about is, if you are not ready at that moment because you're feeling defensive, whatever, you're being triggered, is you want to make a plan that says, look, I want to hear what you have to say. I'm taking this concern seriously. Can we schedule something for tomorrow morning or later on that day or something like that? As opposed to just walking away or dismissing it and having that person feel that they are not heard again, because usually that's what the line is. So it's saying, it's being very self-aware and asking yourself, if I can't have this conversation with Angry Harold right now, maybe what I want to do is acknowledge that there's anger, that there is strong emotion, and can we make a plan to a mutually convenient time and date that is maybe tomorrow morning. And in the meantime, I will do what I need to do to engage in some self-care, whether that means going to my yoga, whether it means having a good night's sleep, whether it means having a complex carbohydrate breakfast in the morning so that my blood sugar doesn't tank, whatever. But it's about that intentionality and that planning. What if you are able to have that conversation at that moment?
Oh my. A statement that's just come in, that has happened, that has only happened to me once, but the person said this in their resignation letter, so there was no opportunity to respond.
Okay, so let's pretend, because this is great. Let's pretend that Angry Harold is still an employee and he's just made this statement without a resignation letter. You act like you're better than everyone else, like no one else can ever have a good idea. I don't like people talking to me like I'm a child. How would you utilize active listening techniques?
We've had something come in through email. Questions to use to respond to the angry statement. How have people talked to you like a child? Can you give me some examples of how I talked like I'm better than everyone else?
Yeah, excellent. Right, you're digging deeper. You're getting more information. Right, what you are doing is saying, okay, rather than defending because I'm being accused of something, I'm being blamed, let me unpack, let me try to get more information of what you, Angry Harold, mean when you are accusing me of being condescending or talking to me in a way that I don't appreciate. Can you give me some examples? That is hard. That is really, really hard because, as Emily very correctly points out, our immediate response or tendency is to defend, right? And depending on how stressed we are or how triggered we may be at that particular moment, perhaps the best strategy is to say, look, I really want to hear what you have to say. Can we arrange to meet tomorrow morning? Or something like that, or what works for you?
You mentioned the trigger response. I'm pretty sure everybody will have heard of the fight or flight response. Yes. I've recently learned about a couple more layers to that. Fight, like immediately get defensive, argue back. Flight, immediately leave the situation. Freeze, freezing, just you don't know what to do, you don't know what to say, so you just freeze. And the fourth one that it's quite new to me is that you fold.
Fold? I've never heard that one before.
Yeah, fight, flight, flee, or fold. And folding is when you just say, yes, you're right, okay. I always envision the two dogs or cats in a fight, and one of them shows the belly to the other one.
Oh, which is sort of the, yeah,
I surrender.
I surrender, I'm being submissive, I recognize you as the alpha in this dynamic. Interesting. I mean, one of the very fascinating things about the dispute resolution field, I'm just gonna go off into a bit of a tangent because it does speak to what Emily was just saying, is that it is becoming increasingly interdisciplinary. And one of the very interesting parts is the role of neuroscience in validating a lot of what people in the behavioral sciences have known forever. And that is everything that we do, we respond emotionally first. It goes all the way back when we were the tiny little primate on the savannah, and we had to figure out whether we were going to get eaten by the big tiger. So all of everything that we do, we filter through emotionally first, and it happens in a split second. It's not even intentional. And it is sort of that, is this person a threat? Am I going to be eaten? Do I defend myself? Do I run away? Do I freeze? Do I put myself in a submissive position? How do I survive this imminent threat of perhaps being eaten or having some harm come to me? Only when we, in that part of our brain, have determined that this experience for this entity or person is not a threat, are we then able to engage our higher brain functions associated with problem solving, active listening, critical thinking, all of that. So that's really, really important in understanding ourselves and how we are genetically hardwired, and also just thinking about conflict and why it's so important that active listening is engaged, because active listening actually lowers the emotional temperature. If you're doing it well and you're doing it intentionally, what will tend to happen is that people who are in a very hyper emotional state, usually angry, through the course of active listening will start to calm down, because what they're experiencing is, wow, for the first time in forever, I am feeling heard. This person is making a genuine attempt at giving me their undivided attention and really trying hard to listen and understand as to where I'm coming from. And so generally speaking, my emotional temperature will start to lower down. And only when we get to that sort of calmer emotional temperature, as all of you know, can we start then to proceed into, okay, can we go into some critical thinking, rational problem solving, blah, 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 blah. All those higher functions associated with our neocortex. And that is, it's fascinating, to see how in many dispute resolution programs, this kind of work is influencing the way that people look at conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So anyone have any ideas about that? How to engage in active listening with the, you act like you're better than everyone else, if no one else can have a good idea. I don't like people talking to me like I'm a child. The person who wrote the email was spot on. Thank you very much. Any other ideas before I move on?
Not seeing any other questions coming in, so I think we can move on. And if anything else comes in, maybe we can come back.
Yeah, and if I didn't respond to any of the previous questions, please remind me, or just ask again, because we do have lots of time. All right, so let's see. Maybe what we'll do is we'll go to the scenario stack. So can you go on to the next slide, please?
Moving to the next slide, the one that says scenario 1, community member approaching board.
All right, so what we've created are 3 scenarios. The first one is this. Faisal, a community member, approached your board to ask for support in a new initiative. You think the initiative has potential. It is at least worthy of further exploration. The problem is that some of your board members have had personal conflicts with Faisal in the past, outside of the board, and you are worried that their personal feelings are getting in the way of being able to assess this initiative objectively. How would you respond? And yes, there is some strategy associated with it. What I would also encourage you to think about is how would you apply active listening to this scenario?
We'll give you a minute or two to type your questions into the question pane, or the responses into the question pane. In the meantime, I can say that in my experience coordinating this project, I have heard about a few instances of this kind of conflict happening. One organization was offered some support from a person that a few of the board members had had conflicts with, and they wished to decline the available support.
Boy, I am so brilliant. I didn't even know this. This is the
Yes.
first time I've heard of it. Wow. Okay. So clearly, I'm absolutely brilliant in creating these things.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yes.
Tap myself on the shoulder. So what happened still?
So what happened was that the organization was able to be offered some support from a different channel. Similar support, but from for someone else. They were not able to resolve the conflict with the original person.
Mm. And so in that situation, there was a strong sort of suspicion that there was the personality conflicts that were getting in the way.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So in that situation, you kind of find it different,
Mm-hmm.
that didn't directly address the conflict. It was just another way of getting the board to consider.
And making sure the board had their needs met.
Right. So we have a question here. To whom will respond? To Faisal, to the board? You tell me. This is. I mean, part of the purpose behind this workshop is you may not have a single response. I mentioned at the very beginning that conflict resolution is complex, multifaceted, multidimensional, because human beings are all of the three. In this situation, we may have, a number of different responses, and so part of the purpose behind this is how would you strategize? What kind of responses would be required, and how would you pursue those responses? How would you sort it out and coordinate it and strategize it?
It's a tough question.
Is it really interesting? I know what you mind.
This is a really interesting idea, Faisal. Would you mind if I first discuss it with the board before deciding how to proceed?
So let's pretend, and thank you, Fudana, for being so participatory. Let's pretend you've already said that to Faisal, right? So Faisal has approached you and said, hey, I have this great idea. I think it's going to really benefit our community. You're going, okay, this is worth exploring further. I don't know if it's ever going to fly, but I think it's worth it. And as a board member, you want to, bring it to the board and have a more rigorous exploration. But then when you bring it to the board, you find out that some of your board members have had these outside of the board personal conflicts with Faisal, and without even knowing more about the proposal, they're already going, well, no, don't talk to Faisal. He's unreliable. He's not trustworthy. He's, he da 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 da. And that's the dilemma that you're at.
I have just received a question through email, or a response through email from Yin, asking the board members, I'm assuming here, what happened? How did you feel then? And what happened as a result? And also, how do you see this idea being implemented in a different way or another idea adopted?
Mm-hmm. All very good questions. Thank you.
So with finding out what happened, how much depth would you go into in asking board members to answer that question?
It depends. And that's the most frustrating and common answer I'll give you to any question that you ask me. It really depends, because remember what I said, active listening is about getting more information. You don't know what you don't know. Well, all I've given you are basically, 3 sentences. That's it. All right. So maybe it's a good, well, do you want to give more time for people to type in, or do you want to move to the next slide?
I think if people would like to, I'm not getting anything more through email, and we haven't had any more comments come in through the questions.
So maybe we'll go to the next slide then.
Okay.
So some of these comments were already identified.
So some of these were identified.
Are we on the right submission?
Yeah, we're on the right slide.
Okay, so yeah, so identified in terms, oh, is it not?
It's not coming up, but I can read out some of the suggestions that you've given.
Okay.
So one possibility would be to map dynamics between board members and Faisal through active listening. Could you talk more about that?
So how many board members are involved in terms of interpersonal past conflicts they've had with Faisal? Is it 2 people? Is it 1 people? Is it the entire board? So part of what I always want to do is have a number of active listening conversations where I get more information. Obviously, as the email person pointed out, you want to have a chat with Faisal and get an understanding, but you also want to talk to the people who are saying, oh, no, you don't want to work with Faisal, he's this, he's that. Tell me more. You mentioned that no, he's unreliable, not to be trusted. Can you give me an example of when this happened? When did it happen? Was this something that happened 25 years ago or last week? Right? I want to know. Encourage the board members to think about separating the person from the problem or the issue. So this is one of the classic principles of effective conflict resolution, where you separate the person from the problem and you treat the problem seriously, not the person. So apart from, board member, your personal feelings towards Faisal, what are your thoughts about the merit of this particular initiative? So if someone else, if this guy named Harold Tan were to come and propose this to the board, and Harold Tan is a complete stranger, you don't know him from a hole in the wall, and he were to present this initiative, how would you assess it? What kind of questions would you ask? So that's part of the separating the person from the problem, and that's again is classic conflict resolution practice. And then the third one is to clarify boundaries. And I know part of the whole purpose behind the maximizing governance is to encourage people to think about how wearing the hat of a board member may be different from wearing the hat of a community member. And what does that mean? So if you are assessing this where you are wearing your hat as a board member, what does that mean? How is that different when you take off that hat and you become just a member in your community? And to think about, what those boundaries look like.
Okay, thank you. Next slide.
Next scenario. Okay. New board member. So Inez is bright, motivated, and recently joined the board. Inez is also younger than many of your board members, and her direct manner is unsettling to some. In the past months, she has had some angry exchanges with other board members over how things are done, and she recently confided in you that she feels isolated and ignored. You want Inez to stay, but you also don't want to upset your longer-serving board members. How would you respond?
I'll give you a minute to think about this. This is something that has come up quite a bit in what I've been hearing from participants in the Maximizing Governance program. Some of the older, more established organizations have a client base that is pretty homogenous, and they might recruit board members from members of their community, people they know. And this can often lead to stagnation. This is something that participants have identified. So one of the major topics that many of the organizations have asked for support with is succession planning. If you are planning for the long-term health and sustainability of your organization, you need to recruit younger people. But your culture of your board also needs to be able to accommodate their ideas and listen to them. So this is quite a topical question and quite useful for many of the organizations that have been participating.
And again, I am surprised at my ongoing brilliance at
Indeed.
being able to read your mind, because again, this is the first time I've heard of this from Emily as well. And yeah, so for those of you, please write anything and anything you wish. So we want to hear from you,
We do.
because I even get bored of hearing myself talk.
In case you missed it before, you can contact me by email if you can't use the questions pane. My email again is emooney@ocasi.org. While we wait for your questions, I can also mention that some of what Harold has mentioned here might be cultural. I know there are people who have very, very different communication styles depending on what culture they were raised in. In some cultures, it is valued to be very, very direct, sometimes even a bit brutal, while in others, you are expected to speak around a problem.
And that is one of the beauties and the frustrations of trying to do a conflict resolution training, because Emily points out two very important elements. One of them is that many of sort of the expected standards of communication are culturally derived in terms of how people speak, and eye contact, for example, is a classic example, right? In terms of whether looking at a person directly in the eyes or looking down is an indication of respect. The other piece which we don't cover in this training is what we call conflict styles, which is how each of us have our own particular style in communication, and how those different conflict or communication styles can result in friction if the way that I feel comfortable expressing is the way that you don't feel comfortable expressing, and how we sort of how we learn to recognize our style and the other person's style and shift and work towards that. So, go ahead, Emily.
One thing that's just come up, the best way to solving this type of conflict will be that taking the courses about common actions will be mandatory for every member of the board of directors. So, Fariba, what I'm hearing from you is that you would recommend a conflict resolution course for your entire board.
Hey, I'm all for training. I'm a big, big fan of training, and as I said, my purpose here is not to teach you how to be completely effective conflict resolvers in 2 hours.
Yeah. Okay. Another question or a response that just came in through email, a suggestion to ask what happened. Was there a time when you felt respected and included on this board?
Absolutely. You want to get more information about the history. When did you join the board? How were the first few moments, times? What seems to have shifted? How many people, have you sort of had run-ins with? How did you feel welcomed when you joined the board? Was there an orientation process? Did you have a mentor that could communicate some of the board values or culture, right? Because every board has a culture. I'm not talking necessarily about race, religion, but an organizational culture. And often conflict arises when we have inadvertently crossed an unspoken boundary. It's like, oh no, it's just not done. Well, how would that person know that it's just not done, or this is not the way that it's done, unless someone tells them? Conversely, Inez may have some very strong ideas about how things ought to be done, because she may be freshly minted from a post-secondary education. She may have previous experience in boards, and so she's the change agent. I mean, here in this very, very brief scenario, we have a hypothesis that there might be some generational conflict. It may be her personal communication or conflict style. It may be other things. We don't know.
And we don't know until we ask.
We don't know until we ask.
Okay. Another question response that's come in, asking us offline to explain in more detail what she's finding frustrating. Maybe you can pick a few issues and help her frame them in a way that will get a more positive response from the other board members.
Absolutely. So part of conflict resolution that we don't cover here is the coaching element, right? And I would suggest that the coaching is one possible part, one element of the problem solving once you have a better idea as to what the situation is.
Okay. Another comment, because cultural differences are almost certainly in play here, some diversity training might be useful.
Yeah. And again, that might be part of the option generation when we get to the problem solving, right? It may be cultural, it may not be cultural. How do you know, right? Could it be a gender thing? Could the gender be part of the cultural? These are all the pieces of information that active listening will help you acquire. And once you have that full three-dimensional understanding of the situation, then you can say, okay, it sounds as if some gender training, some diversity training may be required, because this is certainly an element in what's going on. This may be consistent with the succession planning if we're trying to recruit a younger generation, or if you have a board where you're consciously trying to recruit a more diverse cultural cross-section of different cultures, then you have all of that.
And the next comment is about a very specific situation. A principal employee resigns without notice or transition. She copies her resignation email to a board member in whom she then confides that she had been unhappy and felt underappreciated, but she does not want any of her comments to be shared. She refuses to communicate with anyone else, including her direct supervisor, to whom she had never raised a complaint. How does the supervisor handle this?
Boundaries. What are your boundaries? Right. What is the hat you're wearing in this particular situation? Are you the confidant that listens and shares a bucket of ice cream over a romantic comedy? Or are you there in professional capacity where you have to say, look, this is the process. I can acknowledge that you are unhappy and that you made decisions that you felt are, were in your best interests. I have to redirect you to the appropriate process because I can't get involved. This is not something that is within my ability, jurisdiction, or whatever to do. If you had a complaint about your supervisor, there's a process for that. If you needed to address this, we have processes, and I'm going to direct you to those processes, because I can't be in a position where you're asking me to be a confidant and also exercising my responsibilities as a member of this organization. What are the boundaries?
Yeah, I think there would need to be quite a bit of discussion and consideration about that.
Yeah. I mean, I talked about the different hats that we wear. What is the hat that you are wearing? And based on that, on that hat, then you are executing a certain role. So if Emily was my best bud, then maybe I would spend, Haagen-Dazs, movie night with her, and she can vent and rage and all of that she wants, because that's the particular context. I'm her best friend. But if we have a professional relationship, then the hat that I wear and how I respond will be very, very different.
Mm-hmm. So the supervisor, the question here is, how does the supervisor handle this situation? Obviously, the supervisor would want to know why this employee left. The board member knows, but has been asked not to tell. What does the supervisor do?
For me, it's like my hands are tied. I'm given information that I should not be privy to. As a supervisor, I can't respond to something that I don't know about. Mm-hmm. I have a responsibility to respond to information that I receive, but how, if I don't receive information, how can I respond to it? All I know at this point is that an employee resigned. Happy to engage in a conversation to understand why, but I mean, if I wasn't receiving it, I'd be like, I can't do anything with this information.
I think this touches on something very important, which is that in order for the conflict resolution methods to work, the person has to be willing to share responses to the open and curious questions.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is that classic triangulation where, if Emily and I are siblings, I complain to our parent, or I complain to our younger sibling about what an awful person Emily is because she forgot my birthday, blah, 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 blah. And, the younger sibling or parent goes to Emily and says, oh, you should have remembered Harold's birthday, blah, 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 blah. As opposed to me just having that direct conversation with Emily saying, look, I'm really upset because you forgot my birthday. Part of the reason why we have, these exercises, this active listening, is to get away from the triangulation, because it serves no purpose. It puts the person, the third party, in a very awkward situation, a very uncomfortable situation, and it doesn't actually address the underlying conflict between me and Emily, because we have water under the bridge. This is not the first time that she's forgotten my birthday, whatever.
And if you bring in the third party, you're putting the third party in a very awkward position.
Yeah, and I think it's easier in a professional context because we have clear responsibilities and roles and all of that. If I'm Emily's coworker, I have no ability to sign off on her vacation requests or give her a raise. It's outside of my scope and my authority. So if she wants those things, she can, vent to me about how underpaid she feels or how she would like a month's extra vacation, and I can offer empathy and maybe sympathy, but I can't give her what she wants. She has to speak to another person that has the ability to make those decisions in the organization.
So this connects back to a point that was made very early in the webinar today about power and the importance of understanding power dynamics in conflict.
So say more about that.
So with the employee who left might have been very, very unhappy and felt that she was powerless and could be trying to assert what power she feels she has by leaving in the way that she did.
Yeah. And, I would be curious about what the workplace culture is. I would be curious about, the personality of the supervisor, the personality of the recently resigned employee. I would be curious. I mean, is this something that is more symptomatic that I need to be aware of from a systemic organizational culture point of view, or was this isolated to a particular interpersonal dynamic?
And if this was a really critical employee, it might be wise for board members to do a bit of digging.
Yeah. I mean, I guess for me, the act of, copying another person who doesn't have a role to play and then saying, don't share it, doesn't sit well.
No.
Does not sit well, because if I was on the receiving end of that communication, then it's like, what the heck do you want me to do?
Right. Why did you share this?
What is your expectation? Because more often than not, what they're saying is, I want you to share that information to the supervisor so that I don't have to. In the same way that, in one of my jobs where I worked as student conduct, a student would often say, I want this complaint to be anonymous. Well, so what do you want me to do about it? You're accusing this faculty of being blah, 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 but you want it to be anonymous. How is this faculty going to be able to respond? How am I going to be able to get more information from you if I need to ask, further details?
Right.
What do you want me to do about this? If, and often the student would just be saying, I don't know. Because what they want to do is they say, I want you, Harold, to take it on and go beat up that faculty on my behalf and believe 100% of what I'm saying. That's the underlying thing, as well as I want you to believe and be my pit bull.
I want you to hear me.
And be my advocate and go after this person while I can, while I don't have to do anything. And often that results in a difficult conversation of, no, I won't. I am asserting this. No, there is a process, and this is going to be, your responsibility in that process. And there's no such thing as an anonymous complaint of this ilk, because it's not going to be effective.
Okay. Shall we move on to the next slide?
All right. Yes. So final slide. Okay. So so some of the responses I suggested for the Inez Was that right? Yeah, for the Inez one,
Mhm.
was to avoid the temptation to prematurely engage in problem solving, to demonstrate some empathy through active listening, and again, that acknowledging doesn't mean that you agree. So, in these situations, owning up to your biases, understanding where your sympathies may fall is something that's very important if you want to be able to navigate. All right, so third and final scenario.
We're on the next slide, scenario 3, culture clash.
So Mashid and Vladimir are valuable employees in your organization. As their supervisor, you have noticed tensions between the two of them. Mashid confided to you that she finds Vladimir chauvinistic and condescending towards women. Vladimir confided to you that Mashid makes disrespectful remarks about his place of birth. While neither have escalated to a formal complaint, your other staff have noticed this dynamic and it is affecting the overall workplace. How would you respond?
I'll give you a moment to think about that. Any comments, as always, can go into the question pane or come to me by email. I find that when I'm around conflict, even if it has absolutely nothing to do with me, it has a major impact.
And it's fascinating how neuroscience, again, is validating what many in the behavioral sciences have, or in the therapeutic type of professions have known for eons, right? Which is emotions are contagious.
Yes.
Right? If I walk in with a cloud under my head, it is contagious. If I walk in happy and upbeat, we are hardwired at a neurological level to be aware of each other's emotions, and often we mirror those emotions. And so you're absolutely right. Even though the other people in the office may not be directly involved, they notice. And if these two are very valuable employees who are not getting along, it can be extremely uncomfortable because you're all on pins and needles, right? You're always looking for that landmine. You want to make sure that you don't cause offense to one person and be perceived as being on the other person's side. It just can be awful and uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And I deliberately included in this scenario, some sort of, human rights issues, right? So a little bit of here that could brew up if it's going to be difficult.
So one possible response here is I have to listen to both carefully and figure it out.
So, okay, so how would you do that, Fariba? So utilizing those active listening techniques, and you are correct, how would you tease out some of this information?
What kind of details could you ask for? For example, could ask Mashid, what are some of the specific things that Vladimir has said that have made you uncomfortable?
Give me some examples.
Mm-hmm.
You've identified them as being chauvinistic and condescending.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me more, right? Let me unpack the adjectives that you have used so I can get a more nuanced understanding. And of course, with so many of these things, it's perceptions, right? It's the word that is used and how I perceive it may be different from your intention of how you use that word or behavior. So that's all part of that active listening. Separately one by one, absolutely right, Fariba.
So just before we move on to the next question, I wanted to mention something about responding when a person is telling you about specific maybe sexist comments, for example. For people who haven't experienced that kind of comment directed at them, it can be a temptation to say, are you sure? Maybe that's not what he meant. Oh, no, he must have just been in a bad mood. Oh, you're overreacting, you're misinterpreting.
Yeah. And that's one of the classic things that we do in terms of blocking communication. So in downplaying, in minimizing, in not acknowledging the importance of significance, these are all the ways that you shut a person down. because it's variations on the theme of I don't believe you.
Right.
That's the exact opposite goal of active listening, where active listening is, I don't have to believe you. What I want to know is to understand more. You know, what did that behavior have in terms of your experience? How did you perceive it? How did you interpret it based on your life history, your life experiences? And you're right. You seek that information from both Vladimir and from Mashid.
So we have a comment from Donna here saying, I wonder what you think of seeking additional information about the tension from other staff who are also being impacted.
Absolutely. You know, as I said before, active listening can be scalable. If you're trying to get a sense as to how the scope of this problem, how many people are affected, having those conversations with other staff might help shed some light and offer some objectivity outside of Masha and Vladimir. So your instincts are correct, Donna. You want to get more information, right? This is all about gathering information. You don't have to, at this particular point in time, figure out what to do. That comes later. What you're doing is you're giving yourself the space, the emotional, sort of psychological, whatever you want to call it, space, to just get more information without necessarily figuring out what to deal with it. And in my experience, giving yourself that space to do so is really, really helpful because again, we are so hardwired in our culture to go straight into problem solving. We don't give ourselves the opportunity just to gather information for the hell of gathering information. And I find that as I sort of grow as a dispute resolution practitioner, I really want to have that sense of open curiosity because I get information I would not have ordinarily gathered if I had a more tunnel vision, problem-solving focus. And again, you know, because we don't want this to go to a formal complaint, because we know how messy, adversarial, expensive, disruptive, awful, you know, these things can be, particularly when we're dealing with potential human rights issues. We want to really focus on the early intervention, you know, and to head this off before it becomes a more serious issue.
In some unionized workplaces, people might get into the whole grievance process, which can be very painful.
Yeah, and what we also know from conflict resolution theory is that when there are persistent conflicts, factions start to form. It's just the way that we as Homo sapiens are social animals, and factions do start to form where people gravitate towards Mashid and Vladimir, and that becomes a bigger issue in terms of the impact this is having on the workplace.
So if you have any further comments or questions about the scenario between Mashid and Vladimir, we are eager to hear them. We can offer our own, Harold will offer his own suggestions about how he would approach the situation.
So some basic things that we've already talked about in terms of recognizing your own biases. So if you're this, you may have a natural affinity towards either Mashid or Vladimir, depending on your personal life experiences. You know, you may have an affinity with Mashid because you are a woman. You may have an affinity with Vladimir because you're from his same place of birth, or you too have experienced you know, less than pleasant interactions because of your place of birth. So it's about owning up and being self-aware to your biases. It's about inserting or to avoid inserting your opinion or judgment when you're engaged in active listening. So that's, you know, Emily's point about the minimizing, about the, you know, not believing or downplaying. Or again, you know, if you have your own bias because of your particular life experience, you don't want to insert that. The other piece is, given sort of the political nature, potential human rights and all of that, you may want to consider mediation as an option when you get past the problem solving, or sorry, past the active listening, that's the gathering information, and then you get to the, okay, now what do we do with this? one option may be to consider mediation as a way of addressing this. Any other questions before we sort of move to the final part? And that will be a good segue into talking about mediation.
Not seeing any in the question pane or the inbox, so let's move on.
All right, so the final slide is a little bit about community mediation. And ordinarily I give a bookmark to people with some explanation of what community mediation is at St. Stephen's, but you don't have that. So as I mentioned before, the Conflict Resolution and Training Department offers community mediation and professional services in terms of mediation. The community mediation piece is a free service that is available to all Toronto residents. And we deal with all of the lovely, wonderful pickles that Torontonians get involved with living in a densely populated city. So we deal with property lines, with noise dispute, with pets, all the way to increasingly more serious offenses such as a fraud and assault. This is a program that is run by volunteer mediators. So the cases are assigned to volunteer mediators, and we run a bit. And as I said, this is a free service available to all Toronto residents. The other element is a professional services where it's a fee-based service, and we provide workplace mediations. So if you have a situation where you think it would be better served if you had an impartial third party come in to address it, and that would be more effective, that's also something that St. Stephen's offers. The model that is used in both the community mediation free service as well as the fee-based professional services is the same. And the model is one of a co-mediation where you have two mediators, and we always meet with the parties separately on a one-on-one basis. And that's where we do the active listening. Tell us your story, what brings you here, all of that. And then after we've done the separate meetings, we sit down and say, okay, but what's the best process? And if we feel that mediation is the best process, then we proceed. After mediation, and mediation is a process whereby an impartial third party, the mediator, helps people who are in conflict speak directly to each other at its most simplistic level. Mediation is different from other processes in that we are not interested in any kind of fact-finding to discover an objective truth based on a review of information, evidence. We're not interested in guilt or innocence. We don't do any of that. What we're interested in is how different stories can lead people into conflict. Right, so if Emily has a particular narrative about why she's late and I have a particular narrative about tardiness, it's those stories and how they intersect that is causing this conflict between Emily and me. So that's a difference between other processes where mediators do not tell a party how to solve their own problems. We empower them to find their own solutions. We are the guardians of the process, but we have no stake in any particular outcome. So whatever the parties decide is what's best for them. We don't opine, judge, assess any of that, other than making sure that it's realistic, that it has specific goals and all that kind of stuff. So the mediation process, as practiced by St. Stephen's, is one of three phases. So in the mediation now, right? So we've already had the standalone, private, and confidential. We're at the mediation. There are three phases. The first phase is the parties talk to us, the mediators, and tell their story. And the reason why it may seem a bit redundant or repeating is because every stage of the process is private and confidential. So what Emily may tell us, the mediators, in her private and confidential is literally private and confidential. So if she wants to vent, she can do that. When she's in the room with the other party, gets to put on the table what she wants to put on the table. So that's why we invite them to tell their story, and we do again the active listening, the summarizing, the acknowledging feelings, The second phase is what starts to change things, where we shift the chairs and get the two parties to face each other directly. And then we ask specific questions. So Emily, can you please tell Harold how it felt when he blew up at you in the previous week meeting? So Emily tells Harold, well, I felt this is how I experienced it. Harold, can you please restate to Emily what you just heard her tell you? Then I say, well, Emily, what I heard you tell me was that, you felt really embarrassed and humiliated when I blew up at you in the department meeting. Then Emily, did Harold capture everything that you said? She'll say yes or no, he forgot this key detail. Okay, Harold, can you try again? So it's incredibly frustrating and artificial for many people because that's not the way that we are raised to communicate. What it does, however, is it forces me as Harold to really listen to what Emily is saying and to restate it without inserting my opinion, my judgment, my rebuttal, right? It's mirroring and always checking in to see that Emily has confirmed that I have properly restated and summarized. And then we switch. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. And it can be an incredibly effective way of getting us to start getting past the listening to defend or listening to attack or criticize. So phase 2 is that, and then if we feel that there's been enough understanding, acknowledgement, or whatever, then we shift into phase 3, which is the option generation, brainstorming, problem solving. This particular training does not go into mediation training because the mediation course in and of itself is either a 3-day full day or a 5-day full day course, where you get a lot of role plays. And even then, a lot of participants find that they're overwhelmed. They just don't know how to do it because there's so many elements. But just to give you some perspective, yes, the basic mediation training is 3 days. The more advanced is 5 days. So it's a big time investment, and you can't just learn how to mediate because it's a whole different level of how to resolve conflict because you are now in charge of an entire process. And there's lots of things in terms of how you get people to unstick if they're being disruptive, if all of those kinds of things. So the stage 3 is, again, getting the parties to agree to a way that they can identify common issues, common interests, and work towards arriving at an agreement that they both can live with. And the emphasis here is, I don't tell you how to solve your problem. It's your responsibility to negotiate with the other person and figure it out. Figure something that you both can live with, that you both have a stake in implementing, right? Because your needs, your feelings are included in that agreement. So you would have a personal stake in making sure that this is carried out as a success, as opposed to someone imposing it from you from above, and then you can resist passively or more explicitly. So that's the power of mediation, and it's and it is complex. So again, the purpose of today is not to teach you how to mediate. It's just to introduce the concept and to help you situate it in the context of today. So it may be that, with our last one involving Vladimir and Mashid, that the organization decides that this is a little too hot to handle, that maybe there's no one internally that can be perceived as impartial and unbiased. That's often the case because, often in situations, particularly with unionized environments, HR is not perceived to be unbiased, or the immediate supervisor is not perceived to be unbiased, or may not even have the training to be able to feel comfortable doing that. And so it's contracted out. The added benefit of often having it sort of set outside is that the mediation process in and of itself is confidential. So usually there's some kind of prearranged agreement as to what information can be shared to the supervisor, human resources, or whatever. But generally speaking, anything that is said in the mediation is confidential. If there is an agreement, and if the parties agree to share this agreement with select audiences, then that can be set out. But if the mediation is unsuccessful, nothing gets leaked. And that's designed to ensure that the parties feel as comfortable as possible in being open and honest. So they're roaring about their mutual supervisor or the organizational culture. They can do that within the safe, enclosed, confidential space. And what the goal is hey, parties, can you come to some kind of agreement that you both can live with that captures what is important to you and makes you look good in front of your boss or human resources or whatever, because probably one of the common interests is that you still want to have your job. It's usually the case in a workplace mediation, right? You don't want to get fired, or you don't want to be seen in a bad light. So, there is a vested interest in making sure this works out, that you can both jointly present this wonderful thing that's wrapped up in a red ribbon to HR and say, ta-da! We were successful. So that's in a nutshell what community mediation is, and it's often it's a great model, and increasingly used in a wide variety of contexts. And as I said, I just mentioned two of them, which is the community mediation for the pets, noise, and property lines, all the way to workplace disputes. So any questions in terms of, oh, hang on, let's see.
So there's something coming about not being able to open the handout PDF. If you're having trouble with it, I will resend at the end of the webinar. Sometime this afternoon, you can email me, emooney@ocasi.org, and I will send you a copy of the PDF. It will also be available on OCASI's Maximizing Governance website. That is ocasi.org/maximizing-governance. We will also have a recording of this webinar available later this afternoon or first thing tomorrow morning. Yeah, so those are, the website is the place to go for any of the previous webinars and the PDFs and resources associated with them.
Reminder to please fill out the post-workshop evaluation.
Thank you.
Because it's really, really important for the people who are giving you all this wonderful money to feel as if they're getting some information back. So please take the time to do so. And I'm mindful of the time. Unless there are any specific questions about mediation model, about what we've discussed anywhere between now and the past 2 hours, happy to answer any lingering questions.
If you think of a question later, please feel free to email it to me. I will pass it along to Harold. Another thing I'd like to mention before we go is that there are a few slots still available in our Onboard Canada online governance training program. There are 2 courses available. You can choose one. One is Board Essentials, and the other, Board Essentials is basically for newer organizations or new members of boards who are learning about how, what they're responsible for, what it means to be a board member, and basically how to run your organization as a board member. The other one that's available is for more established organizations. It's called Effective Governance Through the Stages. Earlier in the workshop and webinar series, we had talked about stages of organizational growth, and this second course, we'll talk about things like succession planning and sustainability and so forth. To register for either of those, which you would otherwise be charged $250 for either of those courses, they're still available to participants in this program for free. Training must be completed by October 15th. You can visit, again, ocasi.org/maximizing-governance. I'm seeing one more question in my inbox. So when there is a power dynamic in which the person with less power disagrees with the person with more power, there is no recourse other than mediation?
There are always options. I mean, part of the exploration of power, when you look at it, is there are obvious sort of like the different sources of power, and until you start to understand what those sources of power are, it's very difficult for me to give you a blanket answer. So we're usually good with sort of the obvious sources of power, where, for example, a male may have more power over a woman, or an older person may have power over a younger person. Or a difference of power between education, socioeconomic class, all that kind of thing. There are other ways, though, that power can be rebalanced that sometimes you don't know, right? So there's the, and so it's a complex topic. I don't know if I can give you a one-size-fits-all answer, because part of what I want to do is map out what is the power relationship between the two people involved. And think about how, what are the sources of power for the person who is perceived or identifies as having less power, and how do we balance it out? It may be a process, it may be additional people to be involved. There are so many options without getting more specific information where it can go. So I fully recognize that I'm not really being helpful in this because it really depends.
It's complicated.
It's complicated, and and sometimes we don't recognize that people who are perceived who have less power may actually have a lot of power. So for example, if we're talking about big labor disputes or whatever, the power of public naming and shaming, right? Of embarrassing someone, like because of hey, if I put this out, in the media, your brand is going to get hit hard. So maybe you have a better interest in doing this. That's one example of not necessarily having obvious power. From a person-to-person perspective, it really depends, right? Is this a unionized environment?
Is there an HR representative?
Is there an HR representative? It's like without knowing all these things, it's very difficult to provide an answer.
On that note, that it's complicated. Thank you everyone for participating today. Thank you very much, Harold, for an extremely informative and fascinating presentation. This has been a webinar on conflict resolution with Harold Tan from St. Stephen's Community House, brought to you by OCASI as part of the Maximizing Governance Project funded by the City of Toronto. Thank you everyone. That's the end of today's session.
Bye-bye.